A group of loud bikers thought they could mock a black man in uniform, but what happened next left them panicked and speechless. They made a big mistake, judging someone by his appearance, not realizing the truth about who he really was. You won't believe how quickly their smug confidence turned into shame when he calmly revealed his military ID. This isn't just a story about an unfair encounter. It's about the power of dignity, the courage to stand tall in the face of mockery, and the lesson those bikers learned that day. It's proof that respect should never depend on assumptions. Before we dive into this incredible story, let us know where you're watching from in the comments below. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more stories that challenge stereotypes and show the strength of human dignity. Let's get started. You won't want to miss this. It was a quiet afternoon at a roadside diner nestled along a winding highway. The place was a haven for travelers and locals alike, with its checkered tablecloths, the smell of fresh coffee in the air, and a jukebox softly playing old rock classics. The hum of casual conversation filled the room, until the sharp roar of motorcycle engines broke the peace. A group of bikers burst in, their presence loud and commanding. They wore leather jackets adorned with patches, their boots heavy against the tiled floor. They laughed and joked boisterously as they claimed a table in the corner, drawing glances from the other diners. Their energy was overbearing, but no one dared to challenge them. Sitting quietly at another table was a black man in a clean, well-pressed uniform. His posture was upright, his demeanor calm and composed. He looked like someone who carried himself with pride but didn't seek attention. His name was James, a military veteran on his way home after a long tour of duty. He was used to staying composed under pressure, but he also carried a quiet strength that came from years of discipline and service. James was enjoying a simple meal, hoping for a peaceful moment before continuing his journey. But as the bikers noticed him, the tone in the diner began to shift. One of them leaned over to his friend, whispering and pointing in James's direction. Soon, their whispers turned into chuckles, and then into louder comments that cut through the air. "Hey, nice costume," one of them called out mockingly. "You playing dress-up or something?" James didn't respond. He took a slow sip of his coffee, keeping his gaze steady. His silence only seemed to fuel the biker's amusement. Another one chimed in, "Yeah, you sure that uniform's even real? Doesn't look like it belongs on you." The tension in the room grew palpable. Other patrons glanced at James nervously, wondering if he would react. Some shifted uncomfortably in their seats, clearly uneasy with the biker's behavior but unwilling to intervene. The waitress hesitated near the counter, unsure whether to step in or stay out of it. James remained calm, his face unreadable. He had dealt with worse before, on the battlefield and in life. He wasn't about to let a few loud voices rattle him. But the bikers weren't finished. "You're awfully quiet for someone wearing that," one of them sneered. "What's the matter? Cat got your tongue?" James set his coffee cup down gently and looked at the group. His gaze was steady, unflinching, and far more powerful than any words. For a moment, the bikers seemed to falter, but their bravado quickly returned. "You got something to say, or what?" the leader pressed, his voice louder now, drawing more attention from the room. James reached into his pocket slowly. The bikers exchanged glances, their laughter fading as they watched him. The other patrons leaned in, sensing that something was about to happen. The air was thick with tension, every second stretching longer than the last. When James finally pulled his hand out, he held something small but unmistakable, a military ID. He placed it calmly on the table and pushed it forward so it was clearly visible. The room went silent. The moment James set his military ID on the table, the entire room seemed to hold its breath. The bikers froze for a moment, their expressions shifting from smug amusement to confusion. The leader, who had been the loudest, squinted at the ID, his earlier arrogance quickly turning into uncertainty. "What's this?" one of them asked, his voice now much quieter. "What, are you really in the military or just trying to get sympathy?" James didn't answer immediately. He simply looked at the man, his eyes unwavering. He wasn't trying to start a fight, but he wasn't going to let the disrespect slide either. The leader leaned in, squinting harder at the ID. "I don't believe this," he muttered, as if searching for some flaw in the card, something that would prove it was fake. But there was no doubt. The ID was real, and James was exactly who he claimed to be. One of the other bikers, a younger man with tattoos covering his arms, glanced nervously at his friends. "Hey, man, we didn't mean anything by it," he muttered, clearly uncomfortable now. But the leader shot him a look that silenced him. The tension in the diner was thick. The other patrons shifted uncomfortably in their seats, unsure whether to intervene or stay out of it. The waitress stood behind the counter, biting her lip, wishing she could just disappear. No one knew how to react to the shift in the room. James finally spoke, his voice calm and steady, cutting through the growing silence. "You thought you could mock me because of my uniform," he said, his tone firm but not raised. "But what you don't know is that this uniform represents more than just a job. It represents service, sacrifice, and respect. And I don't need to explain that to you. You can take it or leave it." The leader of the bikers scoffed, clearly trying to hold on to some of his previous bravado. "Oh, come on, man. We were just messing around. No harm meant." But his voice wavered now, losing its edge. James didn't flinch. "It's easy to mock people you don't understand," he said. "It's easy to assume that someone like me is just here for a paycheck or some recognition. But you don't know anything about me. You don't know what it means to serve, what it means to stand in harm's way for people you don't even know." The bikers looked at each other, their earlier smugness giving way to a sense of unease. One by one, their eyes shifted from James's calm face to the military ID on the table. They were starting to realize their mistake. But it was more than just realizing the truth. It was the weight of the realization that they had been disrespectful, not just to a man in uniform, but to everything he stood for. For a moment, no one spoke. The leader of the group shifted uncomfortably, his fingers tapping nervously against the side of his coffee mug. The younger biker, who had been the first to speak up, swallowed hard. He could tell the tension had gone from bad to worse. They had underestimated James, and now they were starting to feel the consequences. "You know," James said, leaning back slightly, "it's not just about wearing this uniform. It's about the respect we owe each other as human beings. But it's clear you don't understand that." The leader opened his mouth, trying to find some way to deflect, to get his control back. But nothing came out. There was no more mocking laughter, no more bravado. The room had shifted, and it wasn't in their favor anymore. The bikers were no longer the loud, dominant force they had been. They were just men who had crossed a line they shouldn't have. James hadn't yelled, hadn't lashed out. He had done nothing but show them the truth, calmly and firmly. And now they were realizing the depth of their mistake. The silence stretched out longer, but this time it wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that happens when someone has said everything that needs to be said, when the truth hangs heavy in the air. Finally, the younger biker broke the silence. "We're sorry," he said quietly. His voice lacked the earlier arrogance. and the words seemed to carry a weight that none of the others had expected. James nodded once, his gaze never leaving the group. "I appreciate that," he said, his voice still calm, but his words carrying the weight of a lesson learned. The leader of the bikers shifted in his seat, his face now red with embarrassment. "Yeah, man," he muttered, barely looking at James. "We didn't mean any harm." James didn't respond. He didn't need to. The bikers had learned their lesson, and they knew it. What had started as mockery had turned into a lesson in respect, a lesson that James had taught them without ever raising his voice. And in that moment, the room slowly began to relax. The tension lifted, and the atmosphere softened. The bikers, no longer confident, quickly finished their drinks, stood up, and made their way toward the door. As they left, none of them spoke. They didn't need to. They had been changed, and they knew it. As the bikers left, their once confident swagger now completely gone, James sat back in his chair, his eyes still focused on the table where his military ID had once rested. The room remained silent for a moment, the tension now replaced with quiet reflection. It was clear that something had shifted, not just in the bikers, but in everyone who had witnessed the interaction. James wasn't the only one who had been challenged. The entire diner had experienced a shift in perspective. The waitress, who had been standing behind the counter, finally stepped forward, wiping her hands nervously on her apron. She glanced at James with a soft smile. "I wanted to say thank you," she said, her voice sincere. "I've never seen anyone handle a situation like that with such grace." James looked up at her, giving a small nod. "It's not about grace. It's about doing what's right." He paused for a moment, his eyes scanning the other patrons in the diner. "It's about standing up when it's needed, even when it's uncomfortable." The waitress nodded, but her smile faded as she looked at the door where the bikers had just left. I don't know," she said, her voice quieter now. "It's a little unsettling, you know, the way they treated you." James leaned forward slightly, his voice steady. "People act out of ignorance all the time. The key is how we respond. I didn't let them provoke me. I simply showed them the truth." He didn't want to admit it, but part of him felt a small sense of satisfaction. It wasn't about proving the bikers wrong, but about showing them something they hadn't expected. He had disarmed their mockery with nothing more than a simple gesture, and the quiet strength that came from his military service. Before anyone could say anything else, a man from a nearby table, who had been watching the entire exchange, stood up. He was older, wearing a baseball cap and a plaid shirt, and he walked toward James with a slow but deliberate pace. Everyone in the diner watched him, unsure of what was coming next. The man reached James's table and looked down at him, his expression unreadable. For a moment, there was a silence so thick you could almost feel the weight of the room holding its breath. "You know," the man began, his voice gruff but not unfriendly, "I saw what just happened, and I gotta say I'm impressed. You kept your cool in a situation most people wouldn't have." James met his gaze and nodded. "Thanks." The man hesitated for a moment, as if searching for the right words. "I wasn't sure what to think when I saw them poking fun at you. I've seen people treated like that before, and usually it ends up in a mess, but you didn't let it escalate." James shrugged slightly. "There's no need for escalation, just a bit of truth, and things tend to calm down." The man studied him for a moment, then reached into his pocket. To everyone's surprise, he pulled out his own military ID and placed it gently on the table in front of James. "I'm retired," the man said quietly. "Army. And I've seen plenty of men who call themselves tough. But the real strength, the kind you showed today, that's what makes a real man." He paused, his voice dropping lower. "And the way those bikers looked after you pulled out your ID? That's the kind of respect we all should be giving each other." James's eyes flickered to the military ID on the table. He hadn't expected this. The man's gesture was a silent but powerful acknowledgement, not just of his own service, but of the importance of honor and respect in all interactions. For a moment, the entire diner was quiet. The room seemed to hold its breath as everyone absorbed the weight of the moment. The bikers had been loud and proud of their bravado, but here was a man who didn't need to shout to prove his strength. He had simply stood tall, showing respect to someone who had earned it. The waitress looked around at the other customers, her expression thoughtful. "I think we all learned something today," she said quietly, more to herself than to anyone else. "And it wasn't just about who's wearing the uniform, was it?" James smiled faintly, his calm demeanor never wavering. "It's never just about the uniform. It's about how we treat each other, and the choices we make when it matters." As the man who had shared his military ID quietly returned to his seat, the tension in the room seemed to dissipate. The atmosphere had shifted once again, this time towards something quieter, more introspective. The bikers may have left, but their lesson lingered. And James, with nothing more than his presence and his dignity, had turned a moment of mockery into one of understanding. The waitress finally spoke again, breaking the silence. "We could all use a little more of that, couldn't we?" James gave a nod, but said nothing more. He didn't need to. The room had already begun to change, and that, more than anything, was the real victory. The bikers had left, their earlier arrogance now replaced by silent regret. The diner felt different now, lighter, but also heavier with the weight of the truth. The air was thick with reflection, as James sat at the table, calmly finishing his meal. He wasn't looking for a confrontation, but somehow that's exactly what had happened. And through it all, he had shown them something they weren't prepared to see. The waitress returned to his table, her smile now softer, more genuine. "Are you doing okay?" she asked, as she wiped down the counter nearby. Her voice was full of concern, but also respect. James nodded, looking up from his meal. "Yeah, I'm fine. Just another day. But sometimes it takes moments like that to remind people that respect isn't something you demand. It's something you earn." She smiled and shook her head, walking away to check on the other customers. But before she could disappear into the back, another customer, this one a man in his late 40s who had witnessed the entire interaction, approached James. He was holding his cup of coffee, his expression hesitant but intrigued. "Hey, I just wanted to say thanks," he said, almost nervously. "I saw what happened with those bikers and, well, I don't know if I could have stayed that calm. You did something most people wouldn't have." James looked up, his expression neutral. "I didn't do anything special. I just didn't let their disrespect affect me." The man smiled slightly, though it was tinged with respect. "No, it was more than that. You taught them something, maybe something they didn't even realize they needed to learn. It's not easy to show strength without violence, without shouting, but you did that." James took a slow breath, feeling the weight of the man's words. He wasn't seeking admiration, but in that moment he felt the power of what had just transpired. "They didn't get it right away," James said, "but in time they'll understand. People always do when they see the truth." The man nodded thoughtfully. "You're right. It's just, most of us don't see enough of that kind of strength these days. We're too quick to fight, too quick to react. But you handled that like a true leader." James didn't respond right away. Instead, he took a moment to reflect. A leader isn't someone who always has to be in front. Sometimes, Leading is about setting an example with quiet strength, not loud words. The man seemed to be taking it all in, and James could tell that his words were resonating, not just with the man, but with the others in the diner who had overheard the conversation. A few patrons had been watching from across the room, and some had even nodded in agreement. James's calm and composed demeanor had left a mark on them all. At that moment, the waitress returned, and this time there was a different energy around her. She walked up to James with a warm smile and placed a fresh cup of coffee in front of him. "On the house," she said softly, "for the lesson in dignity you gave us all today." James smiled, but it wasn't out of pride. It was because for the first time in a long while, he felt like his actions had truly mattered, not just to himself, but to the people around him. "Thank you," he said quietly, not needing to explain further. The atmosphere in the diner was different now. The awkwardness that had followed the biker's departure was gone, replaced by a shared sense of respect. The patrons no longer looked at James as just another customer in uniform. They saw him for what he truly was, a man who had earned the right to wear that uniform, not just because of his service, but because of the strength of character that accompanied it. As the man who had spoken to James walked back to his table, he glanced around at the other patrons, nodding slightly. It was clear that the events of the day had left a lasting impression. People weren't just going to forget what had happened. They were going to remember the quiet strength of the man who had turned an ugly moment into a teaching opportunity. James finished his meal and stood up, preparing to leave. He walked to the counter to pay, his movements slow and deliberate. As he handed the waitress his bill, she looked at him, her expression warm but full of respect. "You're always welcome here," she said. "We'll be a little more careful next time." James smiled, a small but genuine smile, and nodded. "We all have a lot to learn, but we're all capable of it." With that, he turned and left the diner, the door chiming softly behind him. As he stepped out into the bright afternoon sun, James felt a weight lifted off his shoulders. It wasn't the biker's respect that mattered. It was the lesson they had learned, and the reminder to everyone around him about the importance of treating each other with dignity. Inside the diner, the conversation slowly picked up again. But it wasn't the same. The respect in the room was palpable, the tension replaced with a quiet understanding. And as the customers finished their meals and started to leave, the sense of unity was undeniable. James's simple act of standing tall in the face of mockery had done more than just prove a point. It had sparked change. It had reminded everyone that true strength is shown through calm, quiet dignity, and that, ultimately, respect is earned, not demanded. The diner, once filled with tension, had now settled into a quiet reflection. The patrons who had witnessed the exchange between James and the bikers now seemed to carry themselves with more respect, their conversations subdued but thoughtful. James had left, and his lesson had stayed with them. Sometimes, all it takes is one person, one moment, to remind us of the power of dignity and respect. James didn't need to yell, didn't need to prove anything. He simply showed the bikers and everyone in that diner that real strength comes from calm, quiet confidence. His actions were a lesson in humility, in standing firm when faced with mockery, and in treating others with respect, regardless of their background or appearance. What would you have done in James's place? Have you ever faced disrespect, and if so, how did you handle it? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If this story made you think about how we treat each other, don't forget to share and subscribe for more stories that challenge stereotypes and celebrate the strength of character. Remember, respect isn't earned through force. It's earned through action, and like James, We can all make a difference by simply doing the right thing. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next story. Together, let's keep spreading kindness and understanding, one step at a time.